Howdy folks, welcome back. My name's Sandy. This is Sawing with Sandy. I'm out here in my red pine forest standing amongst approximately 10,000 red pine trees. How do I know that? Because I didn't exactly count them. Well, if you can imagine, these trees have a predetermined spacing and I know approximately the land area. So you do a little bit of math, you can figure out how many trees are here. Now, when I'm talking about predetermined spacing, I'm talking about how these trees came to be. These trees are part of a plantation, a red pine plantation. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. A red pine plantation is just that. It's the planting by humans like you and I of these trees. These trees are not natural. They are not, they're not here by chance in these perfect rows. They were planted this way by a machine. Now this happened about 30 years ago, give or take. And the reason I know that is not because I was here watching them do it, but because you can pretty well guess the age of a red pine tree by counting the number of successive branches. So if you start at the bottom and count your way up and you count, let's say 30 branches, that's approximately the age of the tree in the case of these red pine trees. So approximately 30 years ago, these trees were planted, and they were planted over this vast open space here to reclaim old agriculture. This was a big pasture. So if you guys can imagine, there was nothing here, probably some farm animals. There's nothing here in the way of vegetation, completely devoid of any trees, and the people who own this property decided that they wanted to bring something back that was profitable, and so they brought back the red pine trees. Now these were planted in specific spacing, and the spacing was approximately 6 feet between trees and approximately 8 feet between the rows, or maybe that was 8 feet between the trees and 6 feet between the rows. I think I had it right the first time. Anyways, that spacing dictates how many trees are here. It also dictates how these trees grow. I'm going to talk about that a little bit here today, why I do what I do, and that way you learn a little bit more about these red pine plantations and how they differ from forests like you see up there. See that forest up there, all the green leaves, all the variety of vegetation, trees, shrubs, etc., etc. That is the natural forest. This down here, notice how open it is? This is a human-made forest. Guys, welcome back. All right, guys, let's backtrack about 30 years. These trees came to be, they were grown from seed stock, so they're grown from seeds. Generally speaking, the seeds should have come from this basic area, and then the seeds would have been grown into seedlings. The seedlings actually get planted, usually with a tractor, some sort of planting equipment. They get planted in these perfect rows so that we can control the spacing from tree to tree. We can also control the rows that they get planted in, and it doesn't take all day by someone going out with a little spade and a box of seedlings. Anyways, we get the trees planted. 30 years later, they're where they are now. We are at the point where we have to thin trees, otherwise we're starting to reduce the overall growth rates of the trees that remain. If I just leave it to grow naturally, it will naturally thin itself. The strong will survive, the weak will not. But the ones that do survive will likely have a reduced growth rate because they're competing for things like resources, light, nutrients, competition, for all the sunlight, things of that nature, will reduce their growth rate, and so they won't get as big as they normally would if I would have thinned. Anyways, just stepping back from that as well, why on earth are we planting here? Well, as I mentioned before, this was a big open area. And in order to reclaim this area, let's say the previous owner didn't want to do agriculture anymore, they decided to plant something that was profitable. Trees are profitable, especially where I am, and especially this type of tree, which grows in quite high density. And the other thing about these trees is it grows on this type of soil very, very well. This type of soil here is sandy soil. You don't want soil that is not going to drain or periodically flood. That will not allow the red pines to grow. This is very sandy, and so these trees do very, very well here. Other parts of Ontario, Canada here also have big red pine plantations. The reason they do is back in the early part of the 20th century, there was all kinds of cutting of natural forests to make way for agriculture. Well, not all of those tracts of land have sustained the agriculture. Some of those agricultural lands have not done very well for any number of reasons. Maybe the soil wasn't that great, who knows. But then they're looking to reclaim that land back to a profitable state because agriculture is not working. And so they start planting trees, especially when the soil is conducive to trees like red pine. So loamy, sandy soil, very, very good for the red pine and good for the bugs. Just a little sidestep for a minute. I don't know if you guys can see off in the distance there. It almost looks like fog or smoke. It's actually pollen, and I'm not allergic to pollen in the least, but it is getting a little thick to breathe out here. If it's not bugs, it's the heat, and if it's not the heat, it's the cold, and if it's not the cold, it's the pollen. Anyway, it's still a beautiful place to live. Getting back to the red pine. So at this point, this forest needs to be thinned. And what happens during a thinning, typically here in Ontario, sorry, big horsefly got me on the back. They're out to get me, I swear. As I was saying, in Ontario here, when they do thinnings, typically what's prescribed is to cut down every 4th row of these red pine trees. And what that does is it allows for not only harvesting equipment to get down the rows to then harvest the odd tree within the remaining rows, but it also allows for an opening of the canopy, essentially. And when I'm talking the canopy, I'm talking the tops of the trees here. If we were to look up, there's a certain amount of sunlight that's going to hit the ground here, and we want to open that up a little bit so the remaining trees that you're not cutting down get that sunlight so they can continue to grow at their maximum growth rate. We also want to remove rows of trees, as you can see here, so that there's less trees competing for water, nutrients, and that sunlight that the trees that are left over can then utilize to maximize their growth rate. So taking out those rows, easy access, better growing. And as a result, what that's going to do is the remaining rows, so there will be 3 rows between every row you harvest, those rows should theoretically be able to grow bigger, which you then harvest on the second thinning, the second time you come in with harvesting equipment to cut down the trees. So when we're looking at the first thinning, we're looking for an average diameter of all the trees in the stand of approximately 5.5 inches or 14 centimeters. And that's going to be the diameter at about breast height. You guys can imagine here, right about there, if we were to take that diameter, if the average tree was about 5.5 inches, that means we're at the time for a first thinning. Now that's going to vary obviously from tree to tree. Some are more, some are less. That's why we're taking an average. So if you guys can imagine, we make the first thinning, we cut down, let's say this row right here, which I've done, and then we count over 1, 2, 3, and then cut the 4th row again. Count over 1, 2, 3, cut the 4th row again. The 3 rows of trees, which are in between the 2 cut rows, we're not just going to leave them all alone. We're going to go through and cut out any undesirable trees. Any trees that are maybe way undersized, or maybe they have a fork, so they're growing up and then they fork off. A fork is no good because that's not going to provide us much in the way of a good quality tree. So we're gonna cut that one down. Now we're not going to cut down all the dead trees because we want to maintain some habitat, some food sources for things like songbirds. So some of the trees that are dead in these 3 rows, we will leave them. They're not obviously going to help for our profit, but what they're going to do is help for the habitat, for the overall quality of the forest when it comes to wildlife. Now let's just take a step back for one moment here. Let's talk about when trees are going to be planted from seedlings. So typically they're going to be planted as soon as the snow is gone in the spring, as soon as the ground is thawed out for you to get that seedling into the ground. What we're looking for is to get the trees into the ground before they really start to grow for the season. And so when we talk about growth, we're talking about the white root tips. We don't want them to start growing on the seedlings. We also don't want the buds on those seedlings to start elongating, getting longer. If they do, then we've sort of missed that window a little bit. So we're trying to grow them or get them growing just after the winter is done, just before spring fully kicks into gear. And on that same note, when we're talking about thinning, when are we actually coming in to cut? Now, I already told you guys it's going to be based on the breast height diameter, 5.5 inches, give or take. But it's also going to be based on the timing. You want to harvest trees in the winter time. What that's going to do is it's going to protect the trees that are remaining from damage from the harvest. You guys can imagine trees tend to be dormant in the winter time. And so you're not going to damage their bark. Their bark is a bit more solid, so you're not going to damage the bark by brushing equipment up against it by accident, or when trees fall and hit the ground and branches hit other trees, they're not going to damage it that way. So the winter is best. Winter will also prevent the damage to the soil. So the soil will be good and frozen. You can run heavy equipment over this. You can skid over this. Not going to be a problem. You're not going to damage all the duff layer of the forest as well. For those of you guys who have cut down red pines in the warmer months like the summer, you probably know that you don't tend to do that because you end up getting blue stain on the lumber. Now, if that's the look you're going for, that's fine and dandy. But when you're harvesting for someone who's going to buy it, they don't want blue stain on their lumber, generally speaking. And so you got to make sure you're harvesting in the winter so you don't get that. Another reason you want to avoid that blue stain, especially if it's not wanted, is you're going to take down approximately 30% of the trees in the first thinning. Now this stand here, let's assume there's about 10,000 red pine trees here. 30% of that is 3,000 trees. 3,000 trees is going to be worth a little bit of money. And if you guys can imagine, if it has blue staining on it and that knocks the value of those trees down, multiply that by 3,000, well, you just lost a big chunk of change. So here in Ontario, Canada, there's lots of guidelines put out by the Ontario government. Those guidelines will help people figure out how to space their trees. And when I'm talking about spacing again, I'm talking about the distance from tree to tree and from row to row. So the optimal spacing, according to my location, the Ontario government guidelines, is approximately 8 feet by 9 feet. My spacing is not 8 feet by 9 feet. Now, I did not determine the way these trees were planted, but my spacing is 6 feet between trees, 8 feet between rows. So mine are a little bit closer than the optimal according to the documents I've read. What's important about the spacing is this. If we have a look at these trees here, especially if you look upwards, notice how the branches are all just these little squiggly things that just kind of break off. Well, that is on purpose. If we were to have greater spacing here, what would happen is the branches down low on the tree, they would grow a lot bigger. And as a result, they would have to be pruned. They'd have to be cut. It's not simply a matter of them dying off, which is the case right now, because those are not getting enough sunlight to grow. If the spacing was wider, those would grow, and as a result, we'd have a lot more of a job on our hands pruning those limbs in order to make a nice tree for harvest. So having proper spacing is important, especially because we don't get those big thick branches down low. Where we want those big thick branches, or at least branches in general, is up high, approximately half of the tree to a quarter of the tree and up. Down low, if we have big thick branches, what's going to happen is we're going to end up having big knots in our lumber. That's not going to be conducive to getting the maximum profit or the maximum quality from the tree. Now, getting back to that thought about having branches, some of you guys are out there and thinking to yourself, well, what's the problem? Why do we need branches at all? Wouldn't it be easier for harvest and get better quality lumber if we had no branches at all? Well, we have to have them somewhere on the tree because the branches are what hold the needles, the green part. Those needles, as you guys probably can imagine from way back in science class, those are what undergo photosynthesis. That's where it happens. Photosynthesis is critical to a tree's survival. Hence, we have to have some branches so we can have needles so we can photosynthesize. So as we continue our little tour up through the red pine plantation, you're probably coming across trees like these and small little guys like these, and you're saying to yourself, wow, those can't be worth a heck of a lot. And you're right, they're probably not worth as much as some of the big red pines, which tend to be found right now on the perimeter of the stand. But there's still some value in them. There's still the pulpwood industry, which will take trees and obviously mulch all this stuff up and use it for various products. There's also an industry out there, and it might be very popular where you are. It's taking smaller trees and squaring them off in order to make like landscaping lumber, treating it with some sort of preservative, of course, and then putting it down on like a raised flower bed or something of that nature. So small trees are not necessarily useless. They can have some value, but it's going to depend on your market. Hence why you would get a professional in here and have a look at that. One other thing with that, it is not completely useless to not do any thinning at all. Some of you guys may have a red pine plantation or know of one, and there's no thinning going on whatsoever. That does not mean that the lumber in here or the products that are going to be produced are nothing. It just means the lumber that's going to be produced or the products are going to be a bit different. You're not likely to make as many telephone poles or huge log home logs. You're probably going to make different products from the trees that remain. You just got to look in your local market to see what is being purchased and make sure your forest management follows that, because at the end of the day, if you're managing your forest for one thing and there's no market for it, well, you're pretty much just wasting your time. And just one more option for you, just in case you're thinking the only way to get a financial return on your woodlot is to have someone come in and cut it down and pay you. The government, in this case the Ontario government, does have financial incentives for you to maintain a forest just like this without having to bring in a logging company to cut it all down. Definitely worth investigating, because depending on the value of your trees, sometimes the incentive offered by the government is going to be close enough that you would stick with that, as opposed to selling off and cutting all your trees. So guys, as I continue on with my little walking tour here today, I can't help but think what I want this forest to look like in 5, 10, and even 30 years. One thing is for certain, as I'm quickly realizing, I don't want this forest to go anywhere. I want it to be healthy. I want it to be sustainable. I wanted to provide trees for myself to make lumber, but I also wanted to provide habitat and a spot for family and friends to come for not only harvesting trees, but also getting out on the snow machines, getting out hiking and things like that that they can enjoy. So I got to plan very carefully, got to make sure I have the right people involved, and so it'll be very interesting to see how things progress moving forward. I'm glad you guys came along for this little tour here today. If you guys have any questions or comments, make sure you put it down below, and I look forward to seeing all of you next time.